Hello. So I'm Elliot Estrin, Jesse's better half here. A few weeks ago, Jesse called me and said, I really need to come up with a witty, smart talk, and he needs some help. So I went ahead and wrote up a little talk that he's going to give you today. But you can think it's him, and he'll articulate it pretty well. I think the title is Intimations of an Archetypal Theology, Revisioning Soulful Spirituality, which I have no idea what that means. And hopefully, by the end, I might understand what that means. But it's been such a joy and privilege to watch Jesse come to CIS and PCC and learn all about astrology and all this sort of stuff that I don't grok quite as much. A lot of astrology sessions where it just went totally over my head and frustrated him quite a bit. But and then obviously your journey following me to Pacifica, following the younger twin to Pacifica to learn about depth psychology. That's stuff that I really enjoy, and so I think your gift here maybe is integrating those two, the depth and the heights of theory, and hopefully you can do that in a lovely way. That's all I got. Thanks, Jesse Estrin.
Cool, thank you, Elliot. Yeah, we'll talk later. So I label it Archetypal Theology, Intimations of a New Soulful Spirituality. I'm still figuring out what that means. And last year I talked a little bit about the numinous energies and archetypes that we work with here in PCC and the dangers that can come with that, primarily inflation and grandiosity, when we don't know how to work with those energies and integrate them. And I think that's a culture, part of our culture. We don't have initiation ritual elders and a lot of rites and symbols that we've had in past times to hold and help us digest and integrate those energies. And that's something I've worked with, and also, as Robert Moore says, we're living in a time of unregulated pathological grandiosity. So it's a time when we're particularly prone to being possessed by archetypes and energies as opposed to being able to work with them in a healthy human way. So I thought I'd continue a little bit today. I'll define really briefly what I mean by soul spirit and the Puer Senex. Some of you know I've been working with these lovely twin archetypal polarities for a while. And just sharing a little bit of my story and how it's been alive, and I've been working with it because that's all I really know. So what I mean by the Puer is the eternal child. It's a youthful part, but it's part of us that's interested in verticality as opposed to horizontal movement. It's got a flavor of zeal, passion, excitement. That's where inspiration and grand vision come from. Senex is the opposite, carries more of that Saturnian energy. It's more interested in the horizontal world of matter, physical, incarnate, manifest world. And it's about grounding, structure, relationship, and age. And soul and spirit is pretty similar. James Hillman's talk about this, the idea of spirit being kind of the singularity, unity, a oneness, grand vision and meaning. Soul being more of a relational, like emotional relationships, complexes, our suffering, our wounds, our pathologies are found there. It's funny, I don't know how many of you guys might have seen it, but there was this thing going around on Russell Brand, who was like really fired up and it's starting a revolution or something. And I thought it was such an amazing embodiment of that Puer and Senex energy. Russell Brand is like exploding with such enthusiasm and passion, and this other guy is this total Senex, like critiquing and judging, challenging him. So I mentioned last year, for many years, for me, in my early 20s, I got really excited about spirit, and I was meditating a lot. I had a guru, teacher, traveled in India, and I, in retrospect, was really possessed by this spirit energy. That's where all of my attention was. And I was doing that for a number of years, and I noticed a really interesting thing happened. I started having these really interesting dream images coming to me. So I remember one dream, I went to the bathroom, I opened the lid of the toilet seat, and there was a skull in the toilet, and with blank eyes just staring up at me. I was, what the hell? I shouldn't worry about that. I don't know what that means. Yeah, it doesn't mean anything. Stupid skull. And another dream, I had a wounded mountain lion in the back of my car, and I'm racing to the hospital with this injured mountain lion. Another dream I had was this black jaguar chased me up a tree, and I had this image of this jaguar leaping and jumping over these branches, and I was sitting like precariously balanced on these brittle, thin branches, and just as it was coming down on me, I woke up. Another dream I actually had that was here at Esalen was there were these two, again, black feline jaguars, panthers that were part of the land, and this large gold lion, like a savanna from like Africa lion, came charging in, and all of us watched as it hunted down and tackled and killed one of these jaguars. And there was such a profound sense of sadness and loss. And I was sitting with that dream image for a number of years, although I didn't quite know what that meant. A dream of going into these caves and finding these old mummified bats hanging upside down, covered in dust. And one other dream of having to tend to this very large glass tank, like a huge fish tank that was maybe 2 stories high, and it had a giant creature in it. And I had to go down at night and take care of this, and it was tentacles, and it was this huge octopus, and the water was pitch black, and this woman was suiting me up in a like scuba diving suit to go down and take care of this beast, and I was terrified. And the whole time I was just saying, no, there's no way I'm going down there. So these dream images started coming, and that's when I started PCC, I started getting really interested in James Hillman and this concept of depth psychology, which is about the descent, and it's about soul work. So it's tending to the shadow and the repressed, the ignored and neglected material in psyche. And Bly talks about the descent. Ash's work, he calls it the katabasis, the Greek term for getting dropped. He says it increases your stomach for terrifying insights. It's biting on cinders and where you learn to shudder. And Thomas More says, the Icarus pattern includes both flight and the fall. The crash is not the undoing of the archetype, but its resolution. So More writes about this idea of there's an art to falling. There's falling as initiation. And there's this deep soul work which keeps us grounded and connected to community. And we can transform all suffering into the word the ideal, which is a classical sense of being initiated by suffering and holding that suffering close. Jung writes, the possession of complexes does not in itself signify neurosis, and the fact that they are painful is no proof of pathological disturbance. Suffering is not an illness, it is the normal counterpole to happiness. A complex becomes pathological only when we think we have not got it. So there's this idea that there's another layer. We have our spiritual life, and there's one 3 floors down, and it's darker, and it's not just interior, but it's deeper. And in that realm, the soul realm, we're not whole here. We come into form, and we're not whole in these bodies, in this world. So Hillman specifically emphasizes soul making, and he uses it as a compensation because of our overemphasis on spirit in Western the Judeo-Christian history. It's 2,000 years of spirit. And he talks about how in the Gospels and our scriptures, there's no soul language. Religion doesn't do soul well. And so I started working on that. I was in PCC, then I went to Esalen, to Pacifica, and I'm in a men's group. I started doing psychotherapy sometimes 2 or 3 times a week. I've been going to San Quentin, working with men there, working with my dreams, experimenting with sobriety, and in a lot of ways trying to tend to the soul realm as a balancing point. And it's interesting, I started all of a sudden feeling like I almost went too much in that direction, and I started losing my connection to spirit. And I started grappling with Hillman and starting to wonder about, wow, it almost seems like it's an excessive overcompensation for soul. And I went to his seminar on the poor in Senex a number of years ago before he passed, and I remember I got up and asked him, where is that fine line between becoming familiar and intimate with our wounding and our suffering and holding that? And then when does that bleed into a narcissistic, self-reflective kind of just enmeshment with that wound and suffering? When is it appropriate to rise up and try and deliberately move away from that? And when is it appropriate to continue letting that guide us on our journey? And he said a few things, but his whole idea was you wrestle with it without an expectation, and that by wrestling and struggling with it, it slowly drops away. But then he also said, if we keep reprocessing our childhood traumas, that starts to traumatize us. And it becomes the trauma. And at some point, you kind of have to let that go. So he said, instead of dwelling on the childhood trauma, why don't we think about childhood crushes? Why don't we dwell on the crushes? And then he said, play with that word, crush. But another thing I remember him saying then was he was very skeptical of Jung's metaphysics, his Christian metaphysics. And I realized that actually Rick was giving a talk, and there was this way in which Hillman has this Jewish and kind of deconstructionist philosophical critic voice. And I think he was really at odds with Jung, and particularly Jung's tradition in the Christian metaphysics that he had in his psychology. So I started seeing Hillman is kind of overcompensating for soul. And I'd see it. It's almost like the more, his psyche got aligned with the grooves of the Senex, he started, these young, idealistic, excited students would get up, and I'd see him like squashing this when I think he recognized that poor energy within himself. So I've been on this wrestling, and I started feeling ashamed of having any kind of relationship to spirit, any kind of prayer or religious sensibility. I felt like, oh, this is escapism, this is avoidance, I need to stay in soul, and somehow I'd be aligning with the oppressing, grinding machine of Western Christianity that's just mowed over all indigenous mythopoetic traditions. And during this time, the last few years, I had this dream where Paramahansa Yogananda, who is a spiritual teacher of mine and probably encapsulates the archetype of spirit better than anyone else, I was running, and I had his dead body, and I was running in a parking garage, and all his followers were like, I was running away from the followers, like they wanted the body, and I kidnapped this body. And he's a big guy too, and I'm literally wedging him into the trunk of my car. Like I am wedging this unconscious dead body into the trunk of my car, and then I hear people coming, and I run into this side room, and I shove him into a washing machine, and I put him in the water to clunk, clunk, and I'm like looking around, and so meanwhile I'm like, he's dead, and I pull him out or something, and he kind of like opens his eyes, and I was like, oh my God, they're just bright red, they're like no pupil, just red eyes. And he was, and I just thought about that a lot. And he carries the symbol. So my unconscious was speaking to that symbol of spirit, was either unconscious or somewhat dead, but I was putting it in the trunk of my car. And he needed to go into this washing machine to get purged and cleansed and transformed before I could relate with him. So that dream was really alive for me and brought up this question about, how can spirit be authentic for me? I'm Sun, Mercury, Neptune. So spirit has a really strong place for me. I also had a dream recently where I was in analysis with Dr. Jung, and I went to see Dr. Jung, and I show up to his office for therapy, and I'm 30 minutes late. I was like, damn, puer move. But he, and the first thing he says is, you're so young, you're very young, not very old. And then and I was like, okay, thank you. And and then he hits me, taps me on the third eye, and I was thinking about that symbolism of Jung pointing to that direction. So it's been a process for me of reclaiming spirit. And so this question for me is, how has religions are crumbling, they're falling. They're no longer holding the sustenance and the nourishment that we need as a culture. So how can we reclaim religion? How can we re-envision, reimagine spirit and soul? Reimagine our relationship to the numinous? How much has religion been held captive by patriarchy? What is the religious traditions been encapsulated by patriarchy, which literalizes and concretizes and makes fundamentalism and literalism so prevalent? And how can we reclaim these really important rites, symbols, initiatory practices, and a mythic imagination that can help us work with archetypes and help us work with these numinous energies? Because if we don't have a relationship with the divine, with other, then we hold it all within ego-bound realms, and that's what Robert Moore talks about as causing grandiosity and inflation. We hold on to these energies, and we have no way of channeling and letting them flow. So that's been a really big part of where I'm going. And Jung writes to a friend of his in a letter, "The main interest of my work is not concerned with the treatment of neurosis, but rather with the approach to the numinous. But the fact that the approach to the numinous is the real therapy, and as much as yet as you attain to the numinous experiences, you are released from the curse of pathology." So it's this idea of religion and myth as psychoactive. It's the idea of myth is not created, it's the phenomenological dramatization of our encounter with depth. And for so long, religion and religious institutions have held our depth experiences and allowed us to create from them. So this great idea that Jung writes about is relocating. We need to realign the center of gravity of the personality from the ego to the self. And that's the self with a capital S. It's moving our location, the center of gravity, from the ego to the non-personal and the non-egoic. So something that I've been involved with and that's been really interesting for me in soul perspective is going into San Quentin prison. I've been going in for about a year almost, weekly, and I sit with about 30 men. I'm interning with a teacher there, and we use mindfulness and we work with emotional intelligence to hold a container for exploration. And it's been, a lot of them, it's for violent offenders, so a lot of them are in there for life. But working with seeing how these men are healing, and it's in a community, and they're writing letters to their victims and to their family, and they're crying and they're holding each other, and that community element has been so important. And so I've been really interested in, like, where is that senex and where is that puer? I mean, if you think of prison as literalized metaphor, and they were so grandiose and in that puer element, they couldn't be contained, so they committed some crime and now they're literally imprisoned. And they need the boundaries and containers of metal bars and concrete. But also, how much these men also need the puer, like an injection of spirit and of meaning and purpose, and how they, a lot of these men have become religious, and whether that's kind of a fundamentalist, dogmatic take, or a beautifully imaginative, just the religious imagination has allowed them to have a ballast and to hold them when they're being blown. And it's kind of this idea that when people are bogged down in earthly life, the spirit dries it up and the spirit brings vision and purpose. But pure spirit, it has always a risk of becoming anorexic. It can just be pure air and fire, and it needs the moistness and water of soul so that it doesn't dry out. And it's such an important balance. And obviously there's different temperaments and people who need different things. But watching these men has been really interesting, and it's kind of this idea of the reformed, the redeemed criminal, salvation. I was really touched by the film Les Miserables that came out, and it was connected to this redemption and salvation. But this idea for me and so many of my family and friends, there's been such a wounding, tremendous wounding around our Judeo-Christian tradition. Talking about Christ, talking about religion it's really difficult because it's kind of a husk now. The living energy has moved. But I was so touched by that, and there's a line when Jean Valjean he's having his conversion experience, and there's a line in this song which says, "I feel my shame inside me like a knife, and I have a soul, how does he know?" And it was, I was talking to my friend Jessica about shame and how shame is such a core issue. And I realized for people who turn to religion, it feeds that. When you boil it down, it's saying, Jesus loves me, I am loved, I am lovable. I am good. There's redemption there. And there's a profound message there that I fear can get thrown out with the bathwater when we're talking about these things. So this idea that, for instance, Robert Moore, when he's talking about the grandiosity and inflation that can come, he talks about the importance of prayer. And I had a really rough last year of my Saturn return, and I had some health issues come up, but what came up for me when it was so challenging was prayer. It was the most natural thing. And it's as if prayer, we don't have to carry everything. The secularized world we live in, it's like we have to carry everything, the good and the bad. We get to claim our success and feel really good about ourselves, or we contract and shrink and we're completely isolated. So the idea of living in an enchanted living cosmos is we relate to something higher and we hand everything over to something, the numinous other. So this idea and this, another thought that came to me, kind of like Rick's idea of, the solar feminine, the solar masculine, the lunar feminine, the lunar masculine. I was just playing with this idea of having the soulful puer and the spiritual puer, and the soulful senex and the spiritual senex, and how that could tease out some kind of nuances between what these archetypal energies are meaning. And I guess I've been feeling frustrated with the polarity, the opposite nature of these things. And I'm really curious, how can we find the in-between, the space where they connect and they bleed into each other? I love this image of the tree, and it's like the branches and the leaves reach upwards, and it's the nourishment of the rain and of the sun and of the oxygen that feeds spirit, and it rises upwards. And yet it depends directly on the knotted, twisted roots that go deep into the moist, fecund soil, and that's soul, and that's where our pathologies and our sufferings are. But we can only rise up in equal and direct proportion to the depth and the structure of the root system that goes downwards. So this real meeting in between both worlds. And so, yeah, this participatory way of engaging and relating these archetypes and the archetypal realms that we're working with. And that's kind of what my question is like, does religion have to be puer or spirit? Does it have to be anorexic? What are we doing now in this time? A lot of the religions are crumbling. They're husks. The living energy is moved elsewhere. How can we recreate and redefine structures and initiation rites and symbols to feed the mythic imagination? How can we find, where are the ritual elders? Where are these forms for initiating the youth into what it means to be adults and to be living a soulful life in participation with the cosmos? And how can that be brought forth in a way that's alive and reanimate it? So I think that's where I'll leave it for right now, and that's just a little bit about what's been alive for me, and excited to be always in this community where these questions are really alive and really pulling forth and emerging from each other in these conversations to find a way forward for where we are. So thanks. I don't know how much time we have, but if anyone has any questions.
Jesse, I have an imagery of the fire and the water that you used to describe spirit and soul really resonated with me, because in alchemy, the old alchemy and the alchemy of the soul, those are the opposite ends of the soul. So we're talking about soul making, right? In Hillman's sense, fire, spirit, and water, soul, have to come into absolute configuration, because it's also related to the underworld, Persephone as well, and the spirit, right? So there's really, really rich imagery there for you.
Yeah.
So I want to say that you're literally talking about the process of soul making now. When you're talking about the alchemical combination of fire and water, of spirit and soul.
Absolutely. And I think there's obviously so many definitions of soul. Someone asked Hillman, talk about soul, and he's like, you're asking me to define or talk directly about soul. I can't do that. And it's the underworld. And I think he did say soul has a religious function. So there's this element of, I love that metaphor that Becca said about fire, the subtlety of fire entering the iron and heating it from within. And there's like a permeability there that's not gross concrete iron on iron. And I think about the soul in that way, kind of. Jess? Yeah? Jess?
So thank you for a really stimulating talk. The word that kept coming through my mind was grief while you were speaking, and when you brought in the prisoners in San Quentin and how they go through this process of feeling their way through the tragedy that they were a part of taking someone else's life, often is the case, and how it's through grieving and feeling that loss and going through their own shame around that then opened them up to the possibility of creating more spaciousness in their life, to have not only a soulful experience but a spiritual experience. And I think that often, a lot of times, people have so much shame around who they are, like you're saying, this core identification with being bad or wrong or a mistake or inferior, that it's hard to reach out and have prayer and ask for help, because you don't even think you're worthy of anyone reaching their hand out to you. And I was in the canyon after Elizabeth reminded us to be present with the waters here, and I was in the canyon and I just started grieving, and I was releasing all of this pain, a lot of loss happening, at the other side of that, it brings me up to the edge of my existence, and I can feel my body fully on the edge of life, and it like the elation and opening that happens, and then boom, the gratitude of just like, whew, okay, yeah, I'm alive, I'm here, and then the miraculousness of it. And so that meeting of like the soulful grieving of the loss and the pain and suffering opens up into like the spiritual ascent. You know, it's the rooting in and then out. And so I feel that grieving process is essential too.
And it's such a synergy, right? Because if you try and just do spirit, it won't access and you can't drop into soul. And if you just go into soul, you can't rise up. So there's this synergy of like dropping in the soul, it's like cleansing and purifying, and the roots are down, and then it just opens the channel straight up.
It's one of the best definitions of Kundalini I've heard, both of those two.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Jess. Yeah, Liz?
Two things. I think this was, for me, the most powerful talk I've seen you give, which means a lot to me, just being on this journey with you as a friend and watching the pieces of your life, your studies come together. And I appreciate how real you make these esoteric questions and how seriously you have butted up against the question of what happens when you're staying down. Because in my journey, I found that I wanted to honor the grief. I wanted to honor the shadow. But then I would find myself getting, like, sometimes I wouldn't break through, and I could stay stuck there for a long time, and that would mean almost like your life stopping. When you're sad, when you're depressed, like, you don't do very much. And I know I'm taking that question really seriously, and that does seem to be times where you choose to go in and you choose to choose, you know? Like, and when are those moments? And they're different in each person and whatever it is. So I appreciate how seriously you're taking that question, because it feels so important to me right now in a time when we can turn anywhere and see shadow and have to constantly make that choice for ourselves of when to dance with it and when to pray or be in gratitude or laugh or whatever it is, you know?
Absolutely.
It's such a balance, you know? So I'm happy that that's what you're looking at. It really makes me feel good that someone else is doing that.
Thank you. Yeah, when you said that, it reminded me of this kind of natural cyclical nature. It's like there's time for the solar day and like Apollonians. There's the Dionysian or the Hades, the lunar night. And that question is so alive for me. When do you go down? When do you stay down? What happens when you have the urge and the longing to go up? Is there shame? Should you stay? You know, I've felt like, do I have to stay down? That would be escaping the darkness. But this theme of grief is so essential, I think. And Aaron had this great phrase of the wounds as wisdom eyes, and kind of like the stigmata, like the suffering and the wounds that we hold deepen our roots. Just by sitting, I sat with Thich Nhat Hanh with my brother for 5 days recently, and he has this beautiful way of talking about mindful presence and interconnection of all things, but that when grief and suffering arise, he's like, here you are, I will take good care of you. I will hold you like a mother will hold her child. It's rocking with like a maternal loving, but you're holding the grief, you're holding the anger, and you just rock it until it just starts to fade away. If you avoid that and you just move that way and away from it, it will stay. And as Jung and many psychologists talk about, it comes back out in even more deformed ways. It wants to be recognized. And when we hold it and sit with that, our roots deepen, and it allows us profound growth to occur. All right, thank you. Shannon, I don't know where we are with time.
We can do one more question.
Sure.
You completely rocked it, and I want to second what Liz said, having just the honor of watching you over several years now, and relating so much in so many ways, and also following you and Elliot to Pacifica now. But yeah, so I know we don't have that much time. I just wanted to speak to where I am with really doing my best to integrate the roots and the sky, soul and spirit, and I think that with regard to a reclamation of religion, I'm really with that right now, and I think there are a lot of underestimated aspects of Christian and Jewish Islamic mysticism that somaticizes spirit in a way that brings soul and spirit into communion. And so right now, like I sort of identify as a Christian tantrika. I'm initiated in both traditions, and they're both coming together cyclically for me. It wouldn't really make sense from an Orthodox perspective in either camp for that to be the case, but that's what feels real to me. And so, yeah, really, just really working with immanence, which I think thereby really magnifies and mystifies or remystifies our relationship to spirit inside our own bodies. And the re-sanctification of the body as God choosing to be God in the unique form of every single one of us in this room.
Yeah, that's great. And it makes me think of this idea that's come up in conversations here around tradition versus innovation and novelty, and how can we reach into these past religious traditions and harvest these amazing, powerful lineages of thought and wisdom and use that, and also where's the room for novelty and innovation and what's being birthed now as something new and distinct from, and the nuances in that, holding the old in the past, that's Saturn, holding the new and innovation, that's Uranus, and finding our own way with it. Thank you. So,
a super quick comment though, I think your talk was awesome. It reminded me of when I was sitting with Thomas Berry toward the end of his life, and we were talking, I forget how it came up, but he said something about the spirit of the earth. And he stopped and he said, I use the word spirit of the earth and I think it's okay, but really what I prefer the phrase the soul of the earth. For that reason that he felt like it's a numinous dimension of the earth, that spirit has that kind of transcendent association. So it was interesting. I've heard him say spirit of the earth and earth spirit so many times, but to see him pause and say actually soul of the earth and earth soul is slightly better in his opinion than spirit of the earth or earth spirit. Thank you for that.
And there's a way that culture is going down. We're in a collective descent. It's moving towards soul. We've been predominated by spirit. So how do we keep our relationship to spirit as we all collectively take this roller coaster down into soul? Thank you, everybody, very much.